I thought the cruise would be healing. I imagined standing on the deck beside my son, watching the sun melt into the Caribbean, thinking, maybe, just maybe, grief wouldn't feel so sharp with him next to me. I paid for the whole thing. I even upgraded their cabin. But then came the text. "You won't be joining us. Vanessa prefers family only." I stood there holding my coffee, reading it again and again as if the meaning might change. But it didn't. Not when I found the locks on my estate had been changed. Not when the garage remote stopped working. And not when a power of attorney form showed up under my door. Handwritten, unsigned, cold, giving my son's wife legal control over my health, my home, my money. I raised that boy. Nursed him through fevers, paid off his college debt, gave him the very house he thought he could steal from me. But grief does something strange when it turns into clarity. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just sold the estate to strangers, quietly, legally, completely. And when they returned from the cruise, I paid for smiling and sun-kissed. I was waiting. And they realized, too late, what silence can cost. At first I thought I had misread it. I tapped the screen, read it again, and felt the air leave my chest. Vanessa prefers family only. What was I? Then I stared at the words until they blurred. My throat tightened, and I had to grip the counter for balance. I was the one who covered every cent of that trip, thinking of how happy Daniel and Vanessa would be, how maybe this would stitch us back together. And here was my invitation revoked with a few taps of his thumb. I dialed his number before I could think better of it. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. I sent back a single message. "Daniel, please explain this to me. It stayed on delivered, never marked read." I stood in my quiet kitchen in Austin, Texas, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the silence pressing in. Richard's photo on the mantel caught my eye, his smile frozen in time. "Can you believe this?" I whispered to him, though. Only the ticking wall clock answered. The longer I stood there, the more something nodded inside me. I needed to see my home, the estate Richard and I had worked our whole lives for. Maybe Daniel would be there, maybe this was some kind of mistake. I grabbed my keys, my cardigan, and drove the 15 minutes across town. The sun was hot on the windshield, but my hands were cold on the wheel. As I turned into the driveway, something was immediately wrong. The garage remote, the one I'd used for years, gave no response. I pressed again harder, as if that would change it. Nothing. The door stayed shut. My stomach dropped. I tried the front door with my key. It slid in but wouldn't turn. The lock had been changed. My hand trembled as I pulled it back. I stepped back onto the porch, looking at the wide front windows, the ones Richard and I had saved to replace after hail damage years ago. Behind them, curtains were drawn tight. I felt like a stranger standing outside my own life. "Hello," I called, knocking harder than I intended. The sound echoed against the brick. No answer. Just the creak of a wind chime by the eaves. I circled around to the back, hoping maybe the patio door would open. When I pressed the handle, it didn't budge. A new deadbolt gleamed in the afternoon sun, silver and smug. I sank onto the porch chair, the one where I used to sit with Richard on warm evenings sipping iced tea. The cushions were gone, stripped away. Vanessa must have decided they didn't suit her style. My chest burned with a mix of shame and fury. This was my home, the place where I had hosted birthday parties, Christmas dinners, even Daniel's high school graduation barbecue. Every inch of this estate carried my fingerprints, my sacrifices. And now I sat locked out as if I were an intruder. I pulled out my phone again, typed, "Daniel, what is going on? I can't get into the house." I waited, heart hammering. No response. The text hung there like a stone in water. Memories flooded me as I sat there. Daniel toddling across this very lawn, Richard hauling up boxes when we first moved in. The way I painted the shutters myself to save money. I thought of the mortgage payments I had stretched every dollar to cover the years of teaching second graders grading papers late at night to make sure we didn't fall behind. I thought of how proud Richard was when we burned the last payment notice mortgage-free at last. We had laughed, danced in the kitchen with cheap champagne, certain this estate would be our family's anchor forever. And now I was shut out, not by strangers, by my own son. Because his wife preferred family only. The words kept repeating in my mind until they twisted into something poisonous. What kind of family forgets who built the foundation beneath their feet? I stood again, pressing my palm against the door, half expecting it to give way. It stood firm, cold, and indifferent. The house no longer recognized me. My own estate had become foreign ground. The truth was undeniable. I was being erased from the very life I had created. I stepped back, looking at the wide sweep of brick and glass at the manicured lawn I had once trimmed myself, and for the first time I felt the full weight of betrayal. I turned slowly down the walkway, the sun sharp on my shoulders, my breath uneven. Somewhere behind those locked doors, my son was already gone, replaced by silence and closed curtains. And as I reached my car, I understood with a clarity that hurt like a blade. This was only the beginning. I didn't drive home right away. I parked at the small overlook by the Colorado River, the same spot Richard and I used to visit when we needed to clear our heads. I rolled down the window, let the breeze in, and closed my eyes. All I could feel was the thudding ache of memory pressing against my ribs. We bought that house in 1986, back when interest rates were high and our paychecks were modest, but we were young and hopeful. Richard worked at a local HVAC company, and I was teaching second grade at Travis Elementary. We saved every penny, skipped vacations, packed our lunches in brown bags with apples and off-brand crackers, and still we were proud. I remember when the mortgage statement came in every month. It was like a reminder of what we were building. Richard used to say, every payment gets us closer to owning the dirt under our feet. We paid it off in early 2016. 30 years, one sacrifice after another. On the day the final notice came, we popped a bottle of cheap champagne, the kind with the twist cap. I laughed when the cork wouldn't even pop properly. We danced barefoot in the kitchen, just the two of us, and the knowledge that no bank owned us anymore. When Richard died 2 years later, I clung to that house. Not because I needed the space. It was far too big for one person. But because every corner whispered of him. His work boots still sat by the back door, his tools in the garage arranged just so. I kept everything the way he left it, down to the chipped coffee mug he always refused to throw away. And Daniel, I poured everything I had into that boy. We didn't have much, but when he got accepted to the University of Houston, I said yes, before we even figured out how to pay for it. I picked up tutoring after school, even worked summer programs. Richard took weekend shifts fixing AC units just to help cover tuition. I remember driving Daniel down for move-in day, his face lit up full of excitement and nerves. I cried the whole ride home. Not out of sadness, but pride. When he wanted to start his own construction business at 26, I dipped into our retirement to help him get started. It's just a loan, Mom, he told me. But he never paid it back. I never asked. I told myself that's what mothers do. We show up, we give, we believe. Then there was the credit card debt he racked up after the business hit a rough patch in 2019. I cleared it quietly. Nearly $12,000. I didn't even tell Richard's sister, who warned me once. Don't let your love blind you, Evie. He's a grown man. I didn't want to hear it. He was still my boy. And when Daniel met Vanessa, I welcomed her like a daughter. I offered to host the engagement dinner, paid for the rehearsal brunch, even bought her the veil she liked, but said was too extravagant. I wanted her to feel embraced. I wanted her to know that this family wasn't just blood, it was built. But somewhere along the way that foundation cracked. I just didn't see it. Back at home, I stepped inside and was met with silence. The kind that wraps around your shoulders and presses down on your chest. I walked to the mantel and picked up the framed photo from Thanksgiving 4 years ago. All of us smiling. Richard's arm around my shoulder. Daniel and Vanessa sitting close, her hand on his chest like she belonged there. I looked at their faces and wondered when the warmth turned cold. I held the frame tightly, my fingers pressing against the glass. I thought of the ways I had shown up for them again and again like it was my duty. But standing there now, all I could feel was the hollowness they left behind. The doorbell rang. I startled, setting the frame down carefully. For a second, my heart jumped. Maybe Daniel had come to explain himself. I rushed to open it, but it was only Mr. Lively from next door holding my mail. "This got slipped into our box by mistake," he said kindly. "Everything all right, Evelyn?" I hesitated. "Yes," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just one of those weeks." He nodded, not pushing, and handed over the bundle. "Well, if you need anything." "I know. Thank you." After he left, I sat at the kitchen table with the mail unopened, my tea growing cold beside me. I looked out the window at the backyard, the hydrangeas I'd planted with Richard now blooming in quiet defiance. And that's when the thought began to stir. Not rage, not yet. Just the first spark of something colder. A flicker of reckoning. I stood, walked to the photo again. And this time I didn't just look. I saw. The smiles, the poses. They weren't memories anymore. They were masks. And behind them, the truth I had tried to ignore for too long. I had given everything. And now I was being erased. I placed the photo face down on the mantel. For the first time, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like the beginning of something I had long postponed. A few days later, I was balancing my checkbook at the kitchen table when something caught my eye. A $148 charge labeled Home Repair, T&T Services. That wouldn't have been strange, except I hadn't called anyone out to the house in weeks. I hadn't fixed so much as a leaky faucet. Curious, I opened the online banking portal and searched the charge. It was linked to a card I didn't recognize, ending in 3902. I frowned. That wasn't mine. I clicked further back, scanning the past few months. A $212 charge to Sunset Paint and Hardware, another for $89 at Elite Electric, all categorized under home repairs, all routed through the same unfamiliar card. Something didn't sit right. I grabbed my notepad and started jotting them down, watching the list grow. 10 transactions over the last 3 months. Little things all under $300, all buried deep enough not to raise a flag. But together they added up to nearly $2,000. And they weren't mine. I called the bank. After verifying my identity, a woman named Lisa from customer service helped pull up the details. "Ma'am, it looks like these charges are tied to a secondary authorized user on your account." "What authorized user?" I asked, already feeling my pulse quicken. "Let me double-check." "Yes, added in February this year. Vanessa Carter." My stomach turned. "I didn't add her," I said, sharper than I meant to. There was a pause on the other end. "Would you like to file a dispute, Mrs. Carter?" My mouth went dry. "Not yet. Can you send me a full transaction report for the last 6 months?" "Of course. I'll email it and send a physical copy as well." I hung up and sat very still, letting the silence wrap around me. Vanessa had access to my accounts. To my money. Without my knowledge or permission. And I had been too trusting. Or too blind. To notice. I needed help. Not from Daniel, not from anyone who could be swayed or sweet-talked. I needed someone who dealt in facts. That afternoon, I called Thomas Whitaker, my old financial advisor. We hadn't spoken in over a year, not since Richard's accounts were closed out and everything rolled into my name. But Thomas had always been kind and clear-eyed, and most importantly, he didn't sugarcoat. We met the next morning at his office, a modest corner suite in a business park near downtown Austin. He offered me coffee, which I declined. My stomach was in knots. I handed him the printed reports and explained what I'd found. "She's been using your account," he said after a moment, adjusting his glasses. "That's clear. And judging by how these are categorized, I'd wager she knew exactly how to bury them. I never gave her permission." I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I wouldn't even know how to make someone an authorized user." He looked at me for a long moment. "Unfortunately, this happens more often than people think, especially when there's a power imbalance. Financial dependence, trust, family expectations. All it takes is access to the right paperwork and someone with a bit of knowledge." "But she's not supposed to have that kind of knowledge," I said, though even as I spoke, I realized how naive it sounded. Vanessa worked in real estate. She dealt with documents every day, escrows, title transfers, notarizations. She probably knew her way around account forms better than I did. Thomas continued. You'll need to remove her from the account, freeze any auto payments, and monitor everything going forward. I'd also recommend a full audit on your other financials. Retirement insurance, home deed. Just to be safe. I nodded slowly, but inside I was unraveling. What else had she touched? What else had I trusted her with? She didn't do this alone, I said finally. Daniel must have known. Thomas didn't respond immediately, but his silence was answer enough. I left the office with a folder full of highlighted statements and a knot in my chest the size of Texas. I drove home in a haze, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Inside I sat at the kitchen table, the one where I'd written every birthday card, paid every bill, planned every Thanksgiving dinner. I opened the folder and stared at the names of businesses I'd never called and purchases I'd never made. This wasn't just theft. It was erasure. Vanessa was rewriting the lines of control, one small withdrawal at a time. Quietly, legally, strategically. I could see it now. Like someone cutting off the lights in a house one bulb at a time until everything faded to dark. And for the first time since that text, I wasn't just hurt. I was angry. The envelope was beige, no return address. Just my name written in block letters, no salutation, no warmth. Just Evelyn Carter, like I was another file in a drawer. I found it slipped under my front door sometime after the sun had risen. I was making oatmeal barefoot, still wearing my old cardigan, when I spotted it lying quietly on the tile. For a moment I didn't touch it. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. I knew. I just knew. I brought it to the kitchen table, sat down, and took a breath. The seal peeled away with a slow crackle like it had been waiting for me. Inside was a single crisp sheet and a thin pen clipped to the top. No note, no explanation. The heading said it all. Irrevocable, durable power of attorney. I scanned the document, my eyes catching on words like control, executive authority, full medical decisions, and complete financial delegation. I didn't have to read the rest to understand. It gave Vanessa everything, not just access, power. She would have the right to act in my name, make medical choices if I were incapacitated. Access my accounts, manage my estate. Hell, sell the roof from over my head if she wanted to. And I wouldn't be able to reverse it once signed. Irrevocable. I set the paper down, my hands shaking. My tea had gone cold, forgotten beside me. A line came back to me like a whisper. Don't sign anything you don't understand. Richard's voice. He used to say it every tax season, every time we had to renew insurance or refinance. Evie, he'd tell me, don't let politeness get you steamrolled. I remembered how he held my hand the day we updated our wills, how carefully we read every line. We trusted each other, but we always verified. And now here I was alone at my kitchen table being handed a document meant to sever what little control I had left. I flipped to the signature line. Vanessa's name was already printed beneath the section marked Agent. The rest was blank, waiting only for mine. I pushed my chair back hard enough that the legs scraped the floor. The audacity. The timing. Dropping this here like a newspaper, like it was some casual errand. I could hear her voice in my head, light and clipped. It'll just make things easier for everyone. Everyone but me. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, heart pounding, fists clenched. This wasn't a mistake. This was a plan. A quiet, deliberate plan. The cruise, the lock, the credit access. All of it leading here. To this. My hands found the paper again, and for a moment I thought I might rip it to shreds right then and there, but I stopped. My eyes moved to the small all-in-one printer in the corner. Quiet as a breath, I walked over and made a clean copy. Then I folded the original slowly, carefully, slid it into a new envelope, and wrote, "Received, do not sign" on the front in thick black ink. I placed it in the fireproof box in my bedroom, the same one that held Richard's death certificate and our deed to the house. Only then did I allow myself to tear up the copy. The ripping was slow, one corner then the next. The signature line was the last to go. I dropped the shreds into the sink, poured water over them, and watched the ink blur like bleeding wounds. I leaned over the counter, trying to catch my breath. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't guessing. Vanessa wanted everything. And Daniel, silent, complicit Daniel, was letting her take it. I wasn't just being ignored, I was being removed. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't answer the phone when Daniel called hours later. He didn't leave a voicemail, just rang twice and gave up. Maybe he knew I'd seen it. As evening fell, I sat on the back porch wrapped in a blanket even though it wasn't cold. The wind stirred the branches of the pecan tree in the yard, the one Richard planted the year Daniel was born. Its roots ran deep, like mine, and like hell I was going to be dug up without a fight. The next morning I pulled into the small law office on 7th Street, hands clutching the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The sign out front read, James Dalton, Attorney at Law, Estate and Elder Affairs. The words felt heavier now than they ever had before. I had called the day before, explained what was happening in only the barest terms, and the receptionist had said, "Come in tomorrow. Mr. Dalton will make time." He met me at the door himself, mid-60s, tall but slightly stooped with a deep voice and eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked. I nodded. "Come in," he said, guiding me to a quiet office lined with shelves full of neat binders and thick legal books. "Have a seat. You said this was about a power of attorney." I pulled the copied document from my purse and laid it on the desk between us. He read silently for a long moment, his brow furrowing as he turned each page. Finally, he set the papers down and took off his glasses. "This was delivered without any legal briefing?" he asked. "Just slipped under my front door. No note, no explanation." He nodded slowly. "That's not how any of this is supposed to work." "It says irrevocable," I whispered. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "that if you had signed this, you'd be giving someone, Vanessa in this case, permanent authority to act on your behalf. Financially, medically, legally, and you wouldn't be able to take it back." I stared at him, heart hammering. "Even if I changed my mind?" "Exactly," he said. "Once it's signed and notarized, it's done. Unless you can later prove coercion fraud or mental incompetence, which is not easy, especially for someone of your standing and clarity." He pushed the document gently back toward me. "You were wise not to sign." I swallowed hard, my fingers curling around the edge of my coat. "She's been moving in the shadows for months. Accessing accounts, spending money from cards I didn't approve, slipping this under my door like it was nothing. I feel like I've been asleep." He leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, I need to be blunt. This is a textbook case of what we call elder financial abuse, subtle, quiet, and often perpetrated by trusted family members. It doesn't always start with stealing. Sometimes it starts with helping." The words sank like a stone. "But I'm still of sound mind," I said quickly. "I pay my bills. I handle my accounts." "Exactly," he said. "And that's why this is serious. If she had gotten you to sign this and taken it to a notary, the law would presume you did so willingly. From that moment forward, she could sell your house, change your medical directives, even alter your will, and it would all be perfectly legal." My stomach clenched. Even if I said later I didn't understand it. He shook his head. "That wouldn't matter unless you could prove that in court, which frankly is messy and expensive. Best thing we can do now is lock everything down." "What does that mean? I'll draw up a formal revocation of any outstanding power of attorney?" "Real or assumed. We'll send it to all relevant institutions. Your bank, your insurer, the county clerk if necessary. I also recommend redoing your beneficiaries. Strip everything back to your control." I nodded, dazed. "How quickly can that happen today?" "We'll get the revocation notarized here. I'll have my assistant fax it immediately to your bank and retirement administrator. You'll follow up with copies by mail, and I strongly suggest changing all your online passwords." I scribbled that down, my hand shaking slightly. "You're doing the right thing," he said gently. "You're protecting yourself before anything worse happens." I looked down at the document again. Vanessa's name so neatly printed beneath the agent section. I could see it all now. How it might have gone. A moment of pressure, a signature, in a moment of confusion or guilt, and everything Richard and I built could have vanished with the swipe of a pen. Dalton leaned back, his tone firm now. Let me be clear, Mrs. Carter. If you had signed this, you could have legally lost your home by next week, and there would have been nothing the court could do to reverse it. The weight of his words pressed into my chest like concrete. I thought she just didn't like me, I murmured. I didn't think she'd do this. He offered a sympathetic look. Most people don't, until it's too late. I sat in silence while his assistant brought in forms, explained next steps, and helped schedule the notary. My pen moved mechanically. Sign here, initial there. But inside something had shifted. I had always believed that dignity came from staying quiet, from being the steady hand in a storm. But this wasn't a storm anymore. It was theft dressed up in legal clothes. As I walked back to my car, revocation papers safely tucked in my bag, I paused in the parking lot and looked up at the sky. A few gray clouds were forming above the buildings. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel helpless. I felt alert. And Vanessa, she had no idea I was awake now. It was Thomas Whitaker, not James Dalton, who first suggested a private investigator. You've locked things down legally, Evelyn, he told me during a follow-up call. But if she's gone this far already, chances are she's working another angle you haven't seen yet. I hesitated. You think she's still doing something behind my back? He didn't pause. I'd bet money on it. I took his advice. That afternoon, I called a man named Scott Miller. He was recommended through a legal friend of Dalton's, retired from the Travis County Sheriff's Office, now working independently. I explained my situation, gave him the names, Daniel Carter and Vanessa Carter, and asked him to find out if any property documents had been altered or filed. He was quiet, respectful, didn't ask unnecessary questions. Give me 3 days, he said. It only took 2. On the second morning, just before noon, he called. I think you'll want to see this in person. We met at a diner off Burnett Road. He slid into the booth across from me wearing a worn leather jacket and a serious expression. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Just opened his manila envelope and laid out the truth sheet by sheet. First came a set of scanned documents filed with the county clerk, then a copy of an application for a second mortgage, $480, $1,000 submitted to a local credit union. And right there under property owner declaration were Daniel and Vanessa's signatures. Next to Vanessa's name was a handwritten note, gifted estate from Mother Evelyn Carter, April 2023. My hands went ice cold. This is fraud, I whispered. Scott nodded. They filed this last month, claimed the property was transferred informally as a gift. It's not uncommon in family estates, and without a formal revocation or notification from you at the time, the bank didn't raise questions. But I never gifted them anything, I said, trying to control my breath. There's no deed, no written transfer. No, he confirmed. But Daniel co-signed the affidavit. That gave them credibility. I sat back in the booth, feeling the vinyl press against my spine. He knew. He didn't just know, Scott said. He pulled out one final photo and slid it toward me. It was grainy but clear. A surveillance still from inside the bank branch on South Lamar. Vanessa standing at the counter in a cream blouse, her nails immaculate pen poised confidently above the signature line. Daniel stood a step behind her, arms, crossed, mouth drawn in that silent, passive way I knew too well. But it was Vanessa's face that stopped me cold. She was smiling. Not the forced social smile she wore at family dinners. No. This was self-satisfied, assured, victorious. Like she had already moved in, like the house was already hers, and the only thing left to do was finish the paperwork. The photo turned my stomach. She walked into that bank as if she already owned everything, I murmured. Scott didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just left the photo between us like a final nail in the coffin. I stared at it a long time, then folded the documents carefully, tucked them into my purse, and looked out the window of the diner where the sun was still shining like the world hadn't shifted beneath my feet. But it had. They weren't waiting to take from me someday. They had already started, and I was just a signature away from losing it all. The photos started popping up on my feed the same night I got home from the diner. Mate, I hadn't blocked either of them. Some part of me still thought maybe Daniel would reach out, maybe he'd come to his senses. That hope died the moment I saw the first image. Vanessa in a bright red bikini stretched out on a white lounger with turquoise water in the background. "First day of paradise," the caption read, followed by a string of tropical emojis. I scrolled further. Daniel holding a glass of champagne grinning beside a seafood tower. Vanessa again posing beside the cruise ship's infinity pool. A sun hat shading her face like she was royalty. "Living our best life," one caption read. Another said, "Grateful for family time." Family? I stared at those words until my vision blurred. That cruise, I paid for it. Every cabin, every meal, every excursion package they were bragging about. They had locked me out of my own house, siphoned off my money, then toasted each other in the Caribbean on my dime. I felt the fury rise fast, burning up from my stomach to my throat. For a moment, I nearly threw my phone across the room. But then, I didn't. I put the phone down, I stood up, and I didn't cry. That was the last night I let myself feel small. The next morning I called James Dalton. "We're selling the house," I told him. "Now, before they try anything else." To his credit, he didn't sound surprised. "Do you have someone in mind? I don't care who buys it as long as it's done clean, legal, and fast." He was quiet for a moment. "I might know a couple. Young, solid credit. First home buyers. They've been looking for something with charm and history. The kind of place someone built with love." I blinked hard. That's exactly what it is. That afternoon I met Sarah and Brian Lee. She was a NICU nurse. He worked in environmental planning, both polite, soft-spoken, and reverent when I walked them through the house. I showed them the kitchen Richard tiled himself the oak tree we planted when Daniel turned 10, the upstairs room with the skylight where I used to read. "I can feel the soul in this house," Sarah said quietly, touching the railing. "It's rare." I nodded, unable to speak. Within 48 hours they submitted a full offer. No contingencies, 30-day close. Dalton moved faster than I'd ever seen him. "We'll put it under temporary confidentiality," he said. "No online listings, no room for interference. We get it to escrow, they can't touch it." But I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Still, I signed the first stack of escrow documents at Dalton's office, hand trembling only slightly. As my pen touched paper, I felt it, like I was crossing into enemy territory with my flag raised. Every form was a line in the sand. "This will trigger alerts on their end," Dalton warned gently. "Once they see the house is in pending sale, I expect they'll respond." "I'm counting on it," I said. "I want them to know they're not as clever as they think." He pushed the final page toward me. I signed, and just like that it was in motion. A legal transaction worth over $2.3 million signed and protected. The house they tried to take behind my back was now halfway into the hands of strangers who saw it as something worth cherishing, not conquering. I walked out into the late afternoon sun, the copy of the contract pressed against my chest like armor. For the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting. I was choosing, moving, quietly, deliberately. And something told me, they wouldn't like that one bit. The moment the escrow papers were signed, Dalton shifted into another gear. There was no room for delay. Not with Daniel and Vanessa floating back from the Caribbean in 3 days, probably thinking they'd step off the ship and walk straight into a mansion that no longer legally belonged to them. I spent most of that week at Dalton's office surrounded by paper signatures and the low hum of a legal war machine in motion. First, Dalton filed a rescission of deed, an emergency move to challenge the fraudulent second mortgage claim. Then came the quiet title action to formally dispute Vanessa and Daniel's unauthorized declaration of ownership. Alongside it, he added a detailed affidavit outlining how I had never gifted the estate, never signed a transfer, and had proof of financial abuse attempts. The documents were thick with exhibits, bank records, timeline charts, even the photo Scott had taken at the bank. We submitted a full revocation of power of attorney, not just for the unsigned form, but preemptively against any similar documents filed without my knowledge in any jurisdiction. Dalton's assistant overnighted everything to the county clerk, the title company, and the lender attached to the fraudulent mortgage. We had to get ahead of any filing Vanessa might have tried to sneak through while I wasn't looking. Meanwhile, I handled the rest. I called the retirement fund I'd built over 30 years of teaching and changed my beneficiaries. Removed Daniel entirely. I listed 2 charities and Sarah and Brian Lee, the young couple buying the house. Next, I contacted all 3 credit bureaus and froze my credit. No new loans, no new cards. Nothing without my say. I even pulled every report to double-check that there were no open lines I hadn't authorized. Just the one they tried to pull for the mortgage now flagged for fraud. By Wednesday morning, we were exhausted but moving. Every step had to be airtight. The closing on the estate was scheduled for 10 a.m. Friday, Daniel and Vanessa were due back Saturday night. 72 hours. Dalton looked up from his desk late that day, rubbing his temples beneath the fluorescent lights. If one clerk misfiles this, if one signature is off, they could delay the title transfer. And if Daniel challenges it before it's done, we might get dragged into months of litigation. I stared at him. Can we beat the clock? He gave me a long, measured look. If everything goes as planned, yes, but we'll be cutting it close. I took a deep breath. Let's keep going. Thursday was a blur. I signed more forms than I thought a single person could. Every time I initialed another page, I thought of that cruise ship slicing through the Caribbean. Vanessa drinking on the deck, Daniel pretending he didn't know what she'd done. Dalton updated me constantly. Quiet titles accepted for hearing. Judge fast-tracked it. It's symbolic. We won't need to fight it if the sale closes first, but it blocks their leverage. Good, I said. Escrow agent confirmed transfer documents will be ready by noon tomorrow, and the revocation paperwork. Every major bank and institution has a copy. We notarized enough for your glove box. The tension in the office was like static. Everyone walked a little faster, spoke a little quieter. Late Thursday evening, as we triple-checked every document for closing, Dalton looked at me with something close to pride. You've done everything right, he said. And if we cross the finish line tomorrow when they dock in Miami, everything they thought they had will be gone. Not a penny, not a key. I didn't smile. I just nodded. Because I wasn't doing this to feel victorious. I was doing it to survive. And now I was almost there. It was the night before closing when Scott called again. I found something he said, his voice clipped. You should come in first thing. The next morning I drove to his office, my chest tight. The air was thick with tension, the kind you feel when you know what you're about to learn will change things. But not in the way you hoped. Scott didn't waste time. He slid a thin file across the desk. Daniel's construction firm, Carter West Developments. They've been upside down for over a year. I opened the file. Loan defaults, delinquent subcontractor payments, liens from suppliers, and then, toward the back, copies of legal notices from a partner named Mason Hartwell. One document stood out, a debt agreement Daniel signed 6 months ago. It pledged personal collateral if the company failed to repay $600,000 within 9 months. I stared at the signature. Daniel's handwriting hadn't changed since high school. Still tight, all caps confident. Where'd you get this? I asked quietly. Public court filings, Scott replied. Hartwell filed a motion last week to collect. Daniel's deadline is coming up fast, less than 60 days. I swallowed hard. So that's why... Scott nodded. He didn't come for the house out of ambition. He came out of desperation. He pulled out a timeline he'd created annotated with bank withdrawals, cruise bookings, and Vanessa's mortgage applications. She's the one who strategized. But he's the one who signed everything. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the paper trail. Vanessa's name on the second mortgage, Daniel's name on the debt agreement. Every lie they told, every quiet theft, was rooted in panic. When Richard died 5 years ago, Daniel cried at the funeral. Said, "I'll take care of you now, Mom." He'd kissed my forehead and squeezed my hand. And now here he was selling off my future to keep his empire from crumbling. I thought back to when he was 12, building model homes out of popsicle sticks, dreaming about construction. I remembered driving to his first project site years later, watching him beam beside the skeletal frame of a home. He had drive grit, but he also had Vanessa. She told him, Scott said, breaking my silence, that if they didn't secure the estate, they'd lose everything. My throat tightened. So he chose her. Chose survival over me. Scott didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I looked again at the copy of that debt contract. Daniel's signature inked with full knowledge that he might lose everything, unless he took something that wasn't his. I stood slowly, the pages still in my hands. He had signed away his integrity, his promises, our bond. And he had no idea that by tomorrow he'd have nothing left to take. The moving truck was already halfway unloaded when their black SUV turned into the cul-de-sac. I was standing near the mailbox, a manila folder tucked firmly under my arm, watching the new homeowners, Sarah and Brian Lee, supervise as the last of their boxes were wheeled up the driveway. It was early Sunday morning. Quiet. Still. Birds chirped like it was any other day. The SUV slowed to a crawl. Vanessa was in the passenger seat, sunglasses perched on her head. Daniel was driving. They weren't smiling anymore. He hit the brakes at the curb. The driveway, their driveway they probably still believed, was now occupied by a two-man moving crew, a dolly stacked with books and lamps, a potted fiddle-leaf fig. The garage door was open, and inside a welcome mat that read "Home Sweet Home" sat freshly unrolled on the floor. They didn't get out of the car. I waited. It took nearly a full minute before Daniel opened the door. Vanessa didn't move. Her arms were crossed, lips tight. He stepped out slowly, eyes darting between the house and the boxes, as if waiting for someone to explain this wasn't real. I walked forward. "Hello, Daniel," I said, calm even. He stared at me like I was a ghost. "What? What is this?" I didn't answer right away. Just pulled the folder from beneath my arm and held it close to my chest. Behind me, the movers wheeled a mirror into the foyer. Sarah waved at me from the front porch. I gave a small nod. "I told you once," I said quietly, "that I would always protect what your father and I built." He looked pale now. "What are you talking about? Why are there people moving into the house?" I took a few slow steps toward him, enough that he could see the top page inside the folder. Escrow documents, stamped and finalized. "You shut me out of my own estate," I said, my voice low but sharp, "because you wanted every dollar of my millions." He blinked. "Mom, But now," I said, stepping closer, "it's no longer mine." I paused. "Let it settle." His breath caught. "And it will never ever be yours." Vanessa flung the passenger door open and stepped out. "You sold it," she hissed, voice shrill and rising. "You actually sold it. You can't do that." "I could," I said simply, "and I did." "I have a mortgage on this place," she snapped. "Fraudulent." "Already rescinded," I replied. "Your second mortgage application has been flagged and reported. Quiet title has been filed. Your access to my accounts revoked. Power of attorney never signed. Credit access blocked." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, staring at the ground like it might open and explain this all to him. "Mom? We just needed time." "No," I said. "You needed money. And instead of asking, you decided to take—" Vanessa moved toward me like she might snatch the folder, but I took a step back and looked her square in the eye. "You planned this," I said. "I know it. I've seen the photos, the filings, the bank statements. You walked into a bank and lied. Daniel backed you with his signature. And now you'll walk away with nothing." Sarah and Brian stepped outside, then the keys jingling in Sarah's hand. Vanessa turned toward them. "You bought this house." "This is our house." Brian raised an eyebrow. "Actually, ma'am, the deed says otherwise." I didn't move. Daniel looked at me one last time, not with anger, with defeat. His eyes searched mine for some crack, some softness left, but I had given all of that away. Years ago. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned, and walked back to the SUV. Vanessa followed her heels crunching on the driveway like static. They drove away slowly, no words exchanged. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded. Then I exhaled and turned toward the house. No, not mine anymore, but finally not theirs either. The first call came Monday morning, less than 24 hours after they'd returned. It was from South Star Credit Union, the bank Vanessa had submitted the second mortgage application to. The officer left a voicemail first. Calm, professional, but tight-lipped. Please inform Mr. and Mrs. Carter that the application for mortgage against the property at 1126 West Canyon Drive is no longer valid. The title has officially changed ownership, and we have escalated the issue to our fraud investigation unit. I didn't return the call. I didn't need to. By noon, the ripple effect had started. Dalton forwarded me a scanned copy of the bank's formal revocation letter, The language was precise. Clinical applicant submitted misleading property ownership documentation. Mortgage file closed. Bank reserves right to pursue legal action pending outcome of fraud inquiry. That alone would have been enough to shatter Vanessa's plans. But it didn't stop there. That afternoon, Scott Miller reached out again, this time with a screenshot from a local business journal, Carter West Developments, under financial review. Amid lawsuits. Owner silent. It was a short piece, just a few paragraphs, but the damage was done. Mason Hartwell, Daniel's former partner, had gone public. The piece mentioned missed deadlines, contractor complaints, and funding shortfalls. What it didn't say, but what I already knew, was that without the equity from my estate, Daniel's lifeline had snapped. He had been counting on that money, betting on it, and now there was nothing left to save him. Vanessa tried to recover her footing, that much was clear. According to Scott, she made 2 frantic visits to a title office in Travis County, demanding they correct the records and restore her standing on the deed. The clerk refused. Dalton's filings had been bulletproof, and worse word had gotten around. She'd once worked in a boutique agency that handled upscale listings in the Hill Country. Her reputation was sleek, curated, but by Thursday, 2 former colleagues had distanced themselves publicly, posting vague but damning messages online. One agent's ambition shouldn't come at the cost of family integrity, one read. Always know who you're signing for, read another. Vanessa had been whispered about before, but now whispers turned to suspicion. A fraud report at the bank, a failed mortgage on a property she never owned, public questions about her conduct. It didn't take much to tarnish a name in that circle, and hers was starting to rot. Scott sent me one final image later that week, a blurry cell phone photo taken from across the parking lot of Daniel's now empty project site. He sat alone on the curb, head in his hands. Vanessa stood nearby, arms crossed, pacing in circles, phone pressed to her ear like she was waiting for someone to give her a way out. But no one would. Everything they thought they had was built on assumptions, of power, of control, of entitlement. And now it was gone. No money, no house, no standing, just the wreckage of a gamble that failed. They hadn't even lost it in court. They'd lost it quietly, through signatures, filings, choices. And the worst part for them, there was no one to blame. I never saw them again. After everything collapsed, after the title was gone, the mortgage dead, the business ruined, Daniel and Vanessa disappeared from my life like a chapter quietly closing. No lawsuits, no apologies, not even one last cruel text. Just silence. And for once, I welcomed it. I sold the last of my shares, closed accounts I no longer needed, and packed up my essentials. A few weeks later, I moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Cedar Park, just 15 minutes from Martha's place. She cried when I arrived with a bottle of wine and a dusty ficus plant. "This is perfect," she whispered, hugging me tight. It was not grand, not opulent, but enough. My new place has a small balcony where the sun hits just right in the morning. I bought clay pots and planted lavender, tomatoes, and basil. I started reading again. Real reading, not scrolling through statements and contracts. I walk to the library every Tuesday. I sit in the park on Sundays with a thermos of tea. Sometimes I have lunch with Martha and her daughter. Sometimes I just sit alone and listen to the wind. There's peace in quiet things. There's peace in knowing no one's waiting to take from you anymore. And yet, it wasn't the money they almost stole that hurt the most. It was the memory of Daniel, age 7, hugging me after his first Little League win, of Vanessa pretending to help me carry groceries when she first came into our lives, of the promise Richard and I made that family would mean something more than just blood and paperwork. But I've stopped grieving that version of them. People reveal who they are in the silence between their choices. I finally listened. There's no ceremony to healing, no applause, just small things: watering your plants, waking up without dread, laughing at a memory without it turning sour halfway through. Martha and I sit on my balcony sometimes. She brings peach pie and we don't talk about the past unless it slips out between spoonfuls. "You're different now," she said once. "I know," I replied, "but not broken. Because I'm not. I'm whole. More whole than I ever was clinging to a house full of ghosts and a family who only saw me as a key to a vault. Now I have new keys. One to the library box down the street. One to this little apartment that smells like lavender and fresh paint. One to my own peace. Silence isn't weakness. Silence saved me. And it was silence that delivered justice. Quiet, clean, and final. Have you ever witnessed or experienced financial abuse within your own family? I'd like to hear your story. Maybe your voice will help someone else find their silence too.